Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. Got my hook grip on the cup. There's hook grip on every damn rep. No fake sip today. Gotta keep you guys on your toes there, paying attention to that. Alright guys, let's go ahead and start the day off talking about something I mentioned in my training footage yesterday. And this is going to be a little different than some people might think. But what I want to state is, I'm not saying not to do curls or tricep extensions. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm going to state up front, it is my opinion based upon my observations over the years that it is not in your best interest to attempt to isolate muscles. Now, a lot of people are like, well, you do seem to kind of put that stance out anyways. You're very dogmatic about it, but I wasn't always. That's something I finally just concluded after many years. I used to be pro isolation. You guys used to watch me do tons of incline curls and stuff at the end of my powerlifting sessions, right? I've historically always been kind of pro isolation. But as I've looked more at athletes, more at the scientific literature, I've just concluded it is not a good idea to actually attempt to isolate a muscle. And the reason for that is that it's not necessarily ideal for your growth and performance in the long term, even for the muscles you're trying to isolate. Number two, you can't actually isolate muscles. And number three, excessive efforts to isolate a muscle in many cases can contribute to connective tissue inflammation damage, which can limit your overall training. And we'll discuss further in of what I mean of how to get around that while still doing movements that a lot of people think of as isolation movements. But what they really mean for an isolation movement is a single joint moving versus a multi-joint. In other words, a curl, this is an isolation movement, but this is not. See the difference? Your shoulder move, that's it. You added a second joint. That matters a lot for training effect in the long term. And what I mean is, when we talk about the ability to progressively overload, the more joints that you get involved in an exercise, the longer you can progress. In other words, that's something coaches have noted over the decades, that a single joint exercise, the more you try to isolate a muscle, particularly by locking all the other joints into place, what ends up happening is over the course of months, you can't progress as much. In other words, you tend to reach plateaus much faster in your progression of either weight or reps you can do, the more you isolate a muscle. And you notice people have to actually work at it. What is your natural tendency when you try to do any of these movements? Is to bring other joints in, to use body English, to do other things. Why? Because that's a normal human movement pattern. In other words, that is the way your body protects itself. That's the way your body knows how to lift more weight to perform better. That's also the way your body knows how to protect itself from overuse injuries. It is your natural instinct to do that because that's a normal human movement pattern to attempt to do that stuff. And so when you work excessively hard trying to isolate stuff, you have to focus on that. And all these bodybuilders do that, and yet, you see how beat up and busted up bodybuilders get. They're the people who seem to have the most connective tissue problem. They're always complaining about their tendons. They always deal with tendon inflammation. These are guys needing all this stuff on their elbows and their shoulders and their knees, and they want to put sleeves and wraps on everything because of that. That's actually a big problem, is because they're getting inflamed connective tissue from doing that. Because it's not a normal human movement pattern. It isn't to attempt to isolate a muscle. And in many cases, it puts strain and inflammatory stress on tendons because it causes them to rub against bones and things the wrong way at certain points of a range of motion. All right, that's exactly what happens. So that leads to inflammation that makes it harder to train in general and makes you hurt more. And the thing is, you're paying a price for that in terms of possible overuse injuries. In fact, isolation movements contribute more to overuse injuries than most of your compounds do. When we think of as overuse, is where a tendon or something gets rubbed and inflamed to the point to where sometimes it can contribute to it snapping, and we actually get damage or a minor tear or something. That's usually the culprit. Whereas on big compound movements, it's really sloppy form that tends to cause injuries, and it tends to be direct joint damage and things. Like when people think of hurting their back on a deadlift, 9 times out of 10 people who hurt their back on a deadlift is from bouncing it off the floor instead of resetting on every rep, right? Bouncing it. Touch and go deadlifts. That's how it ends up being. It's disc damage most of the time. is what you're looking at. You're going to get more herniations and stuff in your disc. So we're usually looking at some sort of joint damage from really sloppy, bouncy form and stuff on big compounds. That's usually what happens. Whereas in overuse injuries tend to occur at the tendon level, and isolation movements contribute to those more because they're unnatural loading of those tendons. And your body isn't intended to isolate muscles. It doesn't want to do so. I'm going to say the only muscle you might need to isolate to train would be calves. And the question I would ask you guys is, why are you doing a bunch of direct calf work if you're not going to compete in bodybuilding? Let your calves get however big they're going to get from your other training. I think people put a lot of focus on those, and they're largely genetic. As people ask me, what do you do for your calves? And they see my training videos, and I'm like, I don't. I squat and I deadlift. But that's a different aside. Calves might be kind of a different topic outside of the scope of this. We're talking about all the other muscles in the body: pecs, delts, biceps, triceps, traps, things like that. So this is something to consider there. Then when we start looking at programming in the long term, a lot of times it's in your best interest to get a muscle as strong as possible. For obvious reasons, a strength athlete, if they want their triceps to get stronger, they want to improve, say, their bench press or their overhead press or something. So they'll train triceps in the effort to do that, to make them stronger. And for them, that makes obvious sense. But I would argue for guys chasing hypertrophy, you really should be looking at the same concepts, because let's say on your bench press, if you're trying to put extra meat on your triceps to help bring your bench press up, the stronger your triceps get, the more you're going to be able to bench press. The more you can bench press, the more overall growth you can stimulate later also. So in other words, getting stronger triceps could be the key for you, someone chasing just size, could be the key to putting more size on your upper body, just in general, because you're going to be able to handle heavier weights with more overload on bigger movements, because the triceps are going to be more adapted to it. And if they're your weak link there, you're just going to let you handle more weight. You're going to be able to just get bigger in general. But for a strength athlete, obviously it's different. We're training triceps to, say, improve our bench press or improve our press. Well, when you start looking at the data out there, what do we see? The data that is looked at, it is found that when size gains are equal, compound movements make the muscle stronger than when the same amount of size is gained in an isolation movement. In other words, when we test someone who we've had certain people start at a certain point and gain a certain amount of muscle by just doing leg extensions on a machine versus gaining a certain amount of muscle in their thighs from barbell squatting, when we test their leg extension strength, the people who built the quads from that tend to be stronger. They tend to be stronger even at the leg extension, even though they use it. Now some people say, well, why would that be? Isn't there specificity of training? You know, what about the direct carryover? Well, with an isolation movement, it doesn't matter because there is no training effect. There's no neural component to single joint movements. There's less involved in terms of neuromuscular efficiency because you can't train. You're not training a movement pattern. You're simply flexing one joint and one muscle. So you don't get as much neurological. You are only getting the hypertrophy end of it. Whereas when you're adding the multi-joint effect, you do seem to get a better neuromuscular efficiency as well. All right, and that's an important point, because a lot of times we're isolating muscles, not just to make those muscles grow, but we want those muscles to get as strong as possible so that it carries over to our overall development. In other words, oftentimes you're shoring up weak links, because an obvious weak link somewhere in your physique means you're going to have a strength imbalance somewhere that could hurt your overall development, could cause higher injuries, stuff like that, right? I mean, a weak muscle somewhere in the body can cause you to have injuries. It can cause you to just be able to handle less weight safely. It's not a good scenario for anyone who trains. So there's a benefit there. And that's what we come back to again with that training effect, though, because there's more of a movement pattern when you bring another joint into the movement. You have less stalling. You can train it for longer before you stall. And that's a very important consideration. So when we look at it that way, it doesn't make sense to try to isolate muscles. It really doesn't. All you're doing is getting a reduced training effect with possible higher inflammation and overuse injuries. So what I would suggest is just minor variations. If you have something like your triceps and you really want to bring them up, that's why I say doing something like a tricep extension where there is shoulder extension involved, also like this, like on a laying one instead of this, because we know this causes the elbows to inflame. Locking yourself in place and then having a load here where there's a heavy load with the elbows locked down or in a fixed position tends to cause inflammation of those tendons. But that extra movement brings the long head of the tricep in a lot more. And it increases the range of motion of the whole muscle. So in other words, you're going to get more total tricep stimulation through the three heads by doing it that way. And it's going to be easier on the tendons because it's more of a normal movement pattern. And it's because maybe humans have grabbed stuff and pulled themselves up, or they push something down. We don't tend to just do it this way. We're not built to do it that way. We're built to use shoulder extension anytime the elbow goes to lock out, whether it's a punch, pushing something, hitting something down, pressing something down. We tend to use that together, and that's why the long head is part of that, and that's why the tricep has those two functions. So by doing those two functions at once, you're creating a more normal movement pattern that actually works more of the muscle, than if you really tried to strictly isolate it, and it gives less overuse injuries. And that's one example of many. So if you're doing that also, it's also going to make the muscle stronger better, so that it's going to carry over to other stuff you want to do. And that's a perfect example of something, because that is no longer an isolation movement. Even though a lot of people would think of that as just a skull crusher, you're adding a compound component to it that stimulates the muscle better. Same thing, we start talking about biceps. I mean, again, we could talk about curling it up a bit. And, you know, historically, I used to say, no, that's not a good idea because it takes tension off. But we know continual tension doesn't increase muscle growth. It doesn't. There's no reason to think it does. Physiology experts laugh at bodybuilders doing that. Like, if you're just doing that because you're on tons of gear, like if you weren't blasting 3 grams a test, this wouldn't work as well as you think it would. But by doing that, that's another function involved. There is some shoulder rotation involved with bicep function. And you're adding a second joint. You can get a better training effect over time because you now have a motor pattern more involved with it that therefore has a learning curve so that you can push that progression out longer. So you're actually adding in additional work for the bicep. It allows you to handle a heavier weight. Also dealing with potentially less connective tissue strain, because you can movement through a pattern that puts less stress on the tendons at certain points. And then again, it's going to carry over better to your other stuff. If you do your curls in that manner, your biceps are probably going to get a little bit better strength. It's going to carry over better to your chin-ups, your rows, your other stuff you're trying to do. So these are perfect examples that we could look at. And people need to remember, a lot of times when you start trying to isolate muscles, there's a lot of techniques that people use to feel the burn that actually are just connective tissue or joint related. Same thing, people do all these lateral raises. You see bodybuilders talk about turning their pinky up. You know why that burns? Because it crushes the glenoid inside the shoulder joint. It's because it's actually causing a specific type of damage to your shoulder joint that if you take it too far will require surgery to regain proper use of your shoulder without pain. Yeah, it burns. It's not a good burn. So again, things that you need to think about when you start thinking about trying to isolate muscles. I'm not saying not to do some of these smaller movement patterns for smaller muscles. You need to find a way to make them into safer compound movements that are going to give you a better training response, less overuse injuries, less tendon inflammation.